My name is Daniel Herrera, and on the night of December 20th, I was one turn of the key away from fleeing a blind date like a coward. I was parked in front of Sterling Grill, watching snow smear across the windshield while I mentally rehearsed excuses I could text my best friend. Food poisoning, a flat tire, a sudden family emergency. Anything sounded easier than admitting I was terrified of walking through those doors. 3 years earlier, 2 days before Christmas, my ex-fiancée had shattered my life by canceling our wedding and leaving me standing in an empty church. 200 guests, flowers paid in full, music rehearsed, and no bride at the altar, just me and a note that made everything worse instead of better. Since then, December felt less like a celebration and more like a punching bag with my name on it. Each carol another reminder of failure. While I sat in that truck, my phone buzzed with messages from my friend Martin, threatening to call me a coward at the office if I bailed. Somewhere between the fear, the shame, and the freezing air, I had to choose. Keep running from anything that hurt, or finally show up for myself. I had no idea that one simple decision, turning off the engine and stepping into that restaurant, would change everything I thought I knew. If stories about love, second chances, and life turning around when you least expect it speak to you, stick with me, hit like, and subscribe, because this one might make you see Christmas a little differently. The moment I walked into Sterling Grill, the place looked like Christmas had exploded and nobody had cleaned it up. Garlands wrapped around every column, strings of lights crisscrossed the ceiling, and a massive tree in the corner probably cost more than my rent. Holiday music played just loud enough to be inescapable, reminding everyone this was supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year. The hostess greeted me with a professional smile that felt too bright for the heaviness tangled up in my chest. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" she asked, like I was a normal person and not the guy who'd been left at the altar 3 years earlier. "Yeah, Herrera, party of two," I answered, doing my best to keep the tremor out of my voice and my hands from fidgeting with my tie. She checked the screen, smiled wider, and told me my date hadn't arrived yet, then suggested I wait at the bar if I liked. I nodded because I didn't know how to say, "Actually, I'd like to sprint back to my truck and disappear," without sounding unhinged. As she led me through the restaurant, I passed couples holding hands and families laughing, all of them looking like they belonged there. It felt like everyone could read my history on my face, like there was a glowing sign over my head that said, "Christmas Reject." The bar area was quieter, tucked slightly away from the main dining room, with dimmer lights and less noise. I climbed onto a stool, trying to look casual, and the bartender, a young guy with an easy smile, walked over right away. "What can I get you?" he asked, like this was just another Thursday night for him instead of my personal emotional minefield. "Just a beer, whatever you've got on tap," I replied, not really caring what it was as long as I had something to hold. He poured it, set it in front of me, and moved on, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a drink I didn't particularly want. I kept glancing at the clock without meaning to, watching 7:05, 7:10, 7:15 crawl by while my date, a woman named Laura, still hadn't shown up. Martin had never sent me a photo, just insisted she was great and exactly what you need, which now felt both vague and suspicious. To avoid looking like the lonely guy abandoned at the bar, I stared at my phone and scrolled through old texts I wasn't actually reading. Every time my screen dimmed, I'd tap it just to avoid facing my reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. By 7:20, I was seriously considering leaving some cash for the beer and vanishing before anyone noticed I'd been stood up. That was when the front door opened and a gust of cold air swept through the restaurant, dragging snowflakes in behind it. A woman stepped in, shaking snow off her short coppery hair, her coat dusted white, and her posture steady and purposeful. She moved like someone who knew exactly where she was going, eyes sweeping the room in quick, efficient passes. When her gaze landed on me, her expression shifted into a confident, friendly smile, and she walked straight toward my bar stool. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked, her voice warm enough to melt some of the ice wedged in my chest. "Yeah," I said, sitting a little straighter. "I'm Daniel Herrera." Then I added, with more hope than sense, "Laura?" She laughed softly, a little amused, and slid onto the stool next to me, close enough that I could smell something citrusy and floral. "Something like that," she said, which my desperate brain translated instantly into a yes before it even thought to question it. I offered to buy her a drink, and she asked for a glass of white wine, like this was the most natural beginning to an evening. I waved the bartender over, ordered for her, and felt my fear start to morph into curiosity as the night quietly reshaped itself. When the wine arrived, she wrapped her fingers around the glass as if she needed the warmth as much as the drink itself. She looked at me with an attentive, open expression that made it hard to hide behind small talk or rehearsed one-liners. "So, tell me about you," she said. "What do you do? What's your everyday life like when you're not surviving snowstorms?" I told her I worked as a junior financial analyst at Novacor Global, a company with a big name and, for me, very little movement. I explained I'd been in the same position for 4 years, watching others leapfrog into promotions while I stayed exactly where I started. She listened without interrupting, nodding now and then, her eyes never drifting over my shoulder in search of someone more interesting. "Do you like it?" she asked, and somehow that question landed harder than anything else, because, wasn't simple anymore. I said it was a solid job and a stable company, but that most days I felt stuck, invisible, like my work didn't really matter to anyone. She gave me a small, understanding smile and said that no one is truly invisible. Sometimes the right door just hasn't opened yet. Then she told me she worked in operations, lots of schedules and firefighting, as she put it, and that tonight was supposed to be her night off. Her description of work quickly turned into more than just job titles and responsibilities. It sounded like a life constantly on call. She joked that her phone buzzed so often it felt like an extra limb with a mind of its own, always demanding attention. We traded stories about impossible deadlines, last-minute crises, and bosses who never seemed to realize people needed sleep. The nervous energy I'd carried in with me slowly started to loosen, replaced by something more comfortable, almost safe. She asked why Martin had set me up on a blind date, and I realized she was subtly inviting me to talk about things I usually avoided. I hesitated for a moment, then decided that if we were going to pretend this was a real chance at connection, I might as well be honest. I told her December had never been kind to me, but 3 years ago it had turned into something close to a personal horror film. I explained how my ex-fiancée had walked away 2 days before our Christmas wedding, leaving me with a note instead of a conversation. I described standing in a decorated church filled with people, watching pity gather in their eyes when it became clear she wasn't coming. Ever since then, I said, any mention of Christmas felt like rubbing salt into a wound that hadn't fully healed. As I spoke, she stopped fidgeting with her glass and just listened, really listened, taking in every word with quiet intensity. When I finished, she reached across the small space between us and wrapped her fingers around mine, her touch surprisingly steady. "Certain dates hurt more because we once expected them to be beautiful," she said softly, as if she was speaking from experience. "Holiday seasons can make loneliness feel 10 times heavier, like you're the only one faking a smile while the world celebrates." Something about the way she named my feelings made them easier to carry, like she was lifting part of the weight off my shoulders. She didn't tell me to move on or look at the bright side. Instead, she acknowledged that some wounds take longer to stop aching. I told her I'd spent 3 years going through the motions in December, pretending I was fine while secretly counting the hours until January. She nodded slowly, like she had built her own rituals of survival around dates that hurt in ways no one else could see. The bartender passed by a couple of times, glanced at us, and seemed to instinctively leave us alone in our small pocket of honesty. For the first time in years, I felt less like the protagonist of a sad anecdote and more like a person someone wanted to understand. Her phone buzzed again, vibrating against the wood of the bar, and she grimaced when she glanced at the screen. "I'm really sorry," she said, exhaling. "I've got an ongoing scheduling mess at work that I can't ignore much longer." She asked if I'd mind giving her 10 minutes to sort it out, promising she'd be right back and that this wasn't a polite exit. I told her, of course, that it was fine, that I'd be here, even though a flicker of panic asked what would happen if she didn't come back. She slid off the stool, grabbed her coat, and walked toward the entrance, already talking into her phone as she disappeared around the corner. To distract myself, I pulled out my own phone and sent Martin a quick text. "You might have been right. She seems amazing." He responded immediately, his excitement practically vibrating through the tiny speech bubble. "So Laura finally made it?" Then he added something that made my blood run cold. "She's been stuck on the highway for almost an hour. Her car died in the snow." I read the message twice, my brain taking a second to catch up with what my eyes were seeing, my stomach dropping with each word. I looked up, scanning the restaurant, and my gaze landed on the woman I'd just been talking to, now standing by the kitchen in a black apron. From where I sat, I could clearly read the name tag pinned to her chest: Carla, assistant manager. The realization hit all at once. She wasn't Laura, had never said she was, and I'd simply decided to believe what I wanted to be true. I'd poured out some of my deepest wounds to a stranger who happened to work at the restaurant and had just been kind enough not to correct me. Humiliation rushed through me, hot and sharp, making me want to crawl under the bar and stay there until everyone went home. Carla caught my eye across the room, lifted a hand in a small, sympathetic wave, as if she understood my confusion all too well. The bartender reappeared at my side and asked if I wanted another beer, completely unaware of the emotional train wreck happening in my head. "No, I'm good," I said quickly, forcing a smile that I hoped didn't look as broken as it felt. My phone vibrated again with another message from Martin, saying that Laura was desperate to make it, even if she arrived drenched and frozen. I was still trying to figure out how to recover my dignity when the front door burst open with enough force to shake the nearest light fixture. And that was when the woman I was actually supposed to meet stumbled into the restaurant, looking like she'd walked through a blizzard to get there. The entire restaurant seemed to inhale at the same time when the door slammed against the wall and cold air rushed inside. A woman stood there, absolutely dripping, her expensive-looking coat soaked through, leaving little puddles on the polished floor. Snow clung to her short copper hair in clumps, and streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks like dark rivers. She clutched a battered gift in both hands, the wrapping paper sagging and torn, as if it had fought the storm and nearly lost. Her teeth were chattering so hard I could see it from across the room, and her shoulders shook with the effort of just standing upright. Conversations dropped to whispers or died completely, the holiday music suddenly feeling too bright for the silent attention she was drawing. Her eyes swept across the tables, scanning faces with a mix of determination and panic, searching for someone she'd never actually met. When her gaze locked onto mine at the bar, something in her expression softened. Maybe hope, maybe sheer relief that someone looked expectant. Leaving wet footprints behind, she made her way toward me, every step heavy and deliberate, like her body was close to giving out. She stopped right in front of my stool, breathing hard, and managed to say my name like it cost her effort. "Daniel Herrera?" My own voice felt stuck somewhere halfway up my throat, but I forced it out. "Yes, that's me," I said, unable to look away from her shaking hands. "I'm Laura Campos," she said between breaths. "I am so sorry I'm late. Tonight has been a disaster." She explained that her car had died on the highway, leaving her stranded in the middle of a snowstorm with a dead battery and no quick fix. She tried to get roadside assistance, failed, then ended up hitching a ride with a delivery driver who happened to be heading toward downtown. The driver could only take her so far, so she walked the last part in the freezing wind because she refused to just give up and go home. "I know this is probably the worst first impression anyone has ever made," she said, a shaky laugh slipping out. "But I promised I'd be here." She admitted she doesn't break promises, especially not when Christmas is involved, because she hates the way people use the season as an excuse. Up close, it was obvious she was freezing. Her lips were almost bluish, her fingers red and stiff, her entire body trembling. "You could have just canceled," I said, genuinely stunned. "You look like you walked straight through a snowstorm for this." She laughed again, a little wild, and lifted the mangled package between us like a confession. "I wasn't about to show up to a Christmas date empty-handed," she said, even if the gift barely survived the journey. She placed the soggy present in my hands, her fingers brushing mine for a moment before she pulled them back into the warmth of her coat. I peeled away the wet paper carefully, revealing a small silver keychain shaped like a compass, cool and smooth under my fingers. When I flipped it over, I saw a short phrase engraved on the back: "Find your way forward." For a second, everything around me blurred, the noise, the lights, even the cold, because those exact words belonged to someone I'd lost. My college mentor, Professor Velasco, used to say that to me every time I panicked about the future or doubted my own potential. He died during my final year, and with him had gone the one person who consistently believed I could be more than I was. Where did you come up with this? I asked, my voice rough, feeling like someone had just reached inside my chest and touched an old scar. Laura explained that her assistant, Sophia, had read my dating profile, noticed I felt stuck, and suggested something about moving forward. She'd liked the idea of a compass as a reminder that you can choose a direction, even when the map looks blurry. Before I could fully respond, Carla walked by with a tray of drinks and flashed us a knowing grin. "So you must be the real date," she said to Laura, then looked at me with playful amusement. "I'm Carla, assistant manager. You two had a little mix-up earlier. He thought I was you for a while." I felt my face go hot as Laura turned to stare at me, a mixture of confusion and curiosity in her eyes. "You did?" she asked. I admitted that Martin hadn't given me a photo, just a name and endless praise, and that my nerves had done the rest of the guessing. "It's officially the weirdest start to a blind date I've ever heard," she said, then surprised us both by laughing for real. The tension in my shoulders eased a little at that sound, because if she could laugh, maybe the night wasn't ruined. I shrugged out of my coat and insisted she wear it, draping it over her soaked shoulders as gently as I could. We moved to a quiet booth away from the bar, where I ordered hot chocolate and something warm to eat for her shaking hands. Somewhere between the ruined wrapping paper, the compass keychain, and the restaurant staff quietly rooting for us, the real date finally began. We settled into a corner booth that felt tucked away from the rest of the world, the kind of spot where it was easy to forget other people existed. Laura pulled my coat tighter around herself, the fabric still holding a bit of my body heat, while steam rose from the mug of hot chocolate in front of her. Outside, snow continued to drift past the windows in lazy, swirling patterns that made the streetlights glow softer. Inside, the restaurant lights were dimmed just enough that our little table felt like its own small universe amid the holiday chaos. She took a careful sip of the drink, closed her eyes for a second, and let out a tiny sigh that sounded like relief. "Thank you for waiting," she said, opening her eyes again. "Most people would have left 20 minutes after I didn't show. Most people don't have friends like Martin threatening to publicly shame them." I joked, then admitted I was glad I'd stayed. She smiled at that, and the last of the awkward tension from our bizarre start began to dissolve into something much more comfortable. From there, the conversation flowed in a way I hadn't expected from a blind date I'd almost skipped. She asked more about Novacore Global, what my days looked like, and why I felt so stuck. I told her how I'd spent 3 years watching promotions circle around me like planes that never chose my runway. How I gradually stopped applying for internal openings because each no made the next attempt feel pointless. I admitted that my ex-fiancé's words, calling me comfortable with mediocrity, saying I lacked ambition, still echoed at the worst times. It was embarrassingly easy to believe she'd been right whenever I saw younger colleagues leapfrog into positions I'd quietly dreamed of. Laura listened without rushing me, as if each detail mattered, as if this wasn't just a story but clues to understanding the person in front of her. When it was her turn, she spoke about her own relationship with work, and the word balance sounded almost like a joke on her tongue. She described days that blurred into nights, calendars packed with back-to-back meetings, and the constant expectation to fix everything. Her so-called days off were usually just quieter days where the avalanche of problems trickled instead of roared. She confessed that work had become both her pride and her hiding place, a way to avoid sitting alone with her own disappointments. Listening to her, I realized that, in different ways, we'd both been using our careers to avoid confronting what hurt. Slowly, the conversation moved away from job descriptions and toward the kinds of things people usually reveal only after months of knowing each other. She asked about my family, and I told her about my parents retiring to Florida, chasing sunshine after a lifetime of snow. I told her about growing up in a small neighborhood where everyone knew your name and your business whether you liked it or not. She shared stories of her hometown, of a mechanic father and a schoolteacher mother who'd never quite understood corporate life. Her voice softened when she talked about being the first in her family to go to college, carrying both their hopes and her own. We laughed about old holiday traditions that now felt ridiculous and a little sad, like ornaments that didn't match our current lives anymore. At some point, our hands found each other across the table almost naturally, fingers lacing without a formal decision. I told her about Professor Velasco, the mentor who'd believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, the man behind the compass inscription. When I mentioned his death, her fingers tightened around mine just enough to say, "I understand," without words. The hours slipped by unnoticed, the restaurant gradually emptying around us while we stayed anchored to that booth. When the manager finally approached, he did it with a half-smile, apologizing for needing to close up. He joked that we'd officially won the award for most cinematic first date he'd witnessed in years. Laura insisted on paying, arguing that after arriving like a drowned cat, she at least owed me dinner. I pushed back, saying no way was I letting her cover everything after she'd walked through a storm to get there. We compromised on splitting the check and leaving a generous tip for the staff who'd quietly given us space. Outside, the world was quieter, the snow now a soft blanket instead of a violent storm, transforming the street into something almost magical. I walked her toward my truck, insisting again on driving her home, reminding her that her car was still dead on the highway. She protested out of habit, out of independence, then finally nodded, admitting the cold had taken more out of her than she realized. In the cab of the truck, as the heater slowly fought against the lingering chill, we talked about everything and nothing just to delay goodbye. When we reached her building, she thanked me, said she couldn't remember the last time a night had gone so wrong and yet felt so right. The next morning I woke up with the rare feeling that something might actually be shifting in my life. The compass keychain was already hanging from my rearview mirror, catching the pale winter light whenever I glanced at it. Martin texted me early, demanding a detailed recap, practically vibrating with curiosity through his messages. I told him the short version: blizzard, wrong woman, soaked actual date, emotional connection, leaving out the parts one wanted to keep to myself. Not long after, a message from Laura popped up on my screen, asking if I'd like to grab coffee before work at a quiet spot near the office. The cafe she suggested was tucked into a side street I'd never noticed, just far enough from Novacor that it felt outside our orbit. When I walked in, she was already there, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of the coat and storm-wrecked makeup from the night before. She looked younger, less like someone carrying an entire company on her back, and more like a woman trying to breathe. Her smile, when she saw me, was real, but there was also a tension in her eyes that hadn't been there at the restaurant. After we greeted each other and ordered, she said there was something important she needed to tell me before we went any further. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, staring into the steam as if arranging her thoughts there. "Last night I told you I work in operations," she began, her voice careful, "but I didn't tell you exactly what that means." I made a joking comment about her being some sort of high-level firefighter, putting out metaphorical fires across departments. She smiled faintly but didn't laugh the way I expected, and that was my first sign that this conversation was about to tilt. "I'm not just in operations," she said at last. "I'm the chief executive officer of Novacor Global." For a moment, the cafe noise faded into a dull hum, like someone had turned down the volume on everything except her words. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman who'd walked 2 miles in a snowstorm with the name printed at the bottom of corporate memos. Every quarterly report I'd analyzed, every shareholder letter I'd skimmed, every company-wide announcement, all signed by her. She rushed to explain that she hadn't lied exactly. She'd just left out details, wanting someone to see her as Laura before seeing her title. Each minute at the restaurant, she said, had made the truth harder to say, until it felt like dropping a bomb in the middle of our connection. She confessed she was terrified I'd look at her differently, like a walking promotion instead of a person who'd just had a really bad night. She talked about how people changed around her when they discovered her position, suddenly wanting favors, influence, access. "Last night, with you, I got to just be someone who was late, freezing, and trying not to ruin everything," she said with a wry smile. I told her I wasn't angry, just overwhelmed, and that it was going to take my brain a minute to process the fact that I'd kissed my CEO goodnight. At the same time, a fresh wave of fear crashed in, bringing with it the ugly possibilities of office rumors and HR disasters. I admitted I was worried people would assume the worst, that I'd be labeled the junior analyst who got close to the boss for personal gain. The idea of being whispered about in hallways, of colleagues giving me tight, suspicious smiles, made my stomach twist. She nodded, saying those were the exact reasons she tried to keep her role out of the picture for as long as she could. We sat with that tension for a while, the two of us facing not just each other but the corporate world looming behind us. Then, slowly, we agreed that if we continued, it would have to be with brutal honesty and clear boundaries between work and whatever this was. We decided we would try to keep our personal life separate from office politics as much as humanly possible. Outside of NovaCore, we'd be Daniel and Laura, two people with messy pasts and hopeful futures, not analyst and CEO. She promised not to pull strings on my behalf, not to secretly engineer promotions or shield me from consequences I hadn't earned. I promised not to disappear the moment fear spiked, not to project my ex-fiancé's judgments onto her whenever things got complicated. We both knew it wouldn't be simple, but neither of us could pretend there wasn't something worth fighting for here. Leaving the cafe, we walked together until the building where I worked loomed ahead, glass and steel reflecting the gray sky. Right before we went in, we instinctively put a little distance between us, like two actors stepping out of character. In the elevator up to my floor, I stared at my reflection next to other employees who had no idea what was going on in my chest. The compass keychain weighed more than its size would suggest in my pocket, a reminder that moving forward rarely looked tidy. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing. I'd already lived 3 years stuck in one place, and I didn't want that life anymore. As Christmas crept closer, whatever was forming between Laura and me deepened into something we couldn't write off as coincidence. We started meeting at out-of-the-way cafes in the mornings, places where no one from NovaCore seemed to go. At lunch, we'd sometimes sneak to small restaurants across town, timing our arrivals and exits carefully to avoid observant eyes. Some evenings, after long days, I'd end up in her penthouse with its sweeping view of the city lights and its surprising warmth. For the first time in years, December didn't feel entirely like a month of ghosts and unfinished grief. One night, she showed up at my apartment with armfuls of Chinese takeout and a weighted blanket she swore was life-changing. We ate on the couch, containers scattered around us, holiday movies playing in the background more as noise than focus. That was the night I finally told her every detail of the ruined wedding I'd only hinted at before. I told her about picking out the venue, sending invitations, planning the Christmas Eve ceremony down to the last candle. I described reading the note she left, the one that called me comfortable with average, and said she couldn't commit her life to a man like that. I expected Laura to rush in with reassurances, to tell me my ex was cruel or wrong, but she didn't. She listened quietly, letting me vent, letting me cry without flinching or trying to tidy up the mess of it with cliches. When I finally ran out of words, she told me about her own breaking point, the engagement she'd ended for the sake of her career. Her partner had given her an ultimatum: choose between the relationship and accepting the CEO position. She had chosen the job, convinced it was the only way to honor everything she'd worked for since leaving her tiny hometown. For 2 years after that, she'd wondered if she had thrown away the only chance at a family she might ever have. Sitting beside me, she said something I didn't realize I needed to hear. The right person doesn't make you choose between being yourself and being loved. That night, there were no grand gestures, no dramatic lines, just two people sharing the quiet ache of choices that haunted them. We eventually drifted off under the weighted blanket, closer than we had been the night before, and somehow lighter for having shared so much. But outside that cocoon, the working world and its rules waited, ready to push in again as soon as morning came. The reality of our situation hit me hard on Christmas Day when my coworker Andres called to check in. At first, it was just the usual small talk about family plans, food, and the latest snowstorm warnings. Then he asked, casually but curiously, if there was anything new in my personal life, his tone hinting he suspected something. I hesitated, then made the mistake of telling him the truth, that I was seeing someone, and that someone was Laura, our CEO. The silence on the line stretched long enough for me to glance at my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Are you out of your mind?" he finally said, his voice low and serious. "Do you have any idea what that could mean for you at work?" He reminded me of how unforgiving office gossip could be, of how quickly a story could twist into something uglier than the facts. He mentioned HR, company image, and the optics of a junior analyst getting involved with the person at the very top of the ladder. After we hung up, anxiety slammed into me hard enough that I opened my laptop and went straight to the internal policy portal. I found the section on relationships between employees in different levels of the hierarchy and started to read like my life depended on it. The policy made everything feel more real and more precarious all at once. Any relationship involving a significant difference in authority had to be disclosed to HR within 2 weeks of becoming serious. The company reserved the right to reassign, restructure, or even terminate one or both employees if the relationship posed a conflict of interest. I read the paragraphs over and over, each time feeling like the ground under my feet grew less solid. If we were honest, we risked becoming the center of an internal storm we couldn't control, our careers dangling in someone else's hands. If we hid it and someone found out, we could be fired not for loving each other, but for breaking the rules about love. When I finally showed the policy to Laura, we sat shoulder to shoulder on her couch, our faces lit only by the glow of the laptop. She stared at the words, her jaw tightening as if she could grind the letters into dust with her teeth. Then she told me there was something else I needed to know, something the board had been pressing her about for months. Novacore's European operations, especially in London, were bleeding money, and the board wanted her to personally go there to fix it. It wasn't just a short assignment. They wanted her in London for at least 2 years, maybe 3. From a career standpoint, it was a dream. Turn around a failing region, stamp her name on a major corporate success, and cement her legacy. From a personal standpoint, it was a nightmare waiting to happen, an ocean between us, a time zone gap, and pressure that would swallow everything. They've been calling it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the weight of those words. She admitted she'd been putting off giving a final answer, hoping something might shift inside her or around her. But with each passing week, the pressure from Ricardo Montalvo, the chairman of the board, had been getting heavier. He framed it not as a request, but as the natural next step for a CEO who truly cared about the company's future. Hearing it laid out like that, I realized that we weren't just fighting HR policies or gossip. We were up against the corporate machine itself. If she said yes, we were done or doomed to a long-distance strain we both knew might break us. If she said no, she'd be branded as the CEO who refused to do what needed to be done, no matter how much she'd already sacrificed. New Year's Eve arrived with a kind of inevitability that made my stomach twist. The board had chosen, of all places, Sterling Grill for their annual dinner, the same restaurant where everything had started. Laura asked me to come as her date, wanting me there even if the night ended up delivering news neither of us wanted to face. I put on my best suit, tied my tie with practiced hands, and tried to convince myself that I was ready to see this through. When we walked into the private dining room, we were greeted by a long table surrounded by impeccably dressed board members. Ricardo Montalvo stood to welcome us, his smile polished, his handshake firm, his eyes taking in every detail like a forensic accountant. "Good to see you, Laura," he said, then glanced at me with a polite curiosity that felt more like judgment than kindness. She introduced me as her boyfriend, making our relationship official in a room full of people who could affect both our futures. I could almost see the math happening behind their eyes. CEO plus junior employee equals potential scandal or at least a juicy rumor. We took our seats, and before appetizers were even fully served, Montalvo motioned Laura over to a quiet corner of the room. From my place at the table, I watched their conversation unfold mostly in body language and sharp little gestures. He leaned in close, talking low and fast, like someone presenting an ultimatum while pretending it was a compliment. Her posture went from relaxed to rigid, shoulders tightening, fingers curling into subtle fists at her sides. The rest of the table pretended not to notice, but I could feel several glances flicking in their direction, tracking every shift. When she finally came back to sit beside me, there was a sheen in her eyes that she'd covered carefully with flawless makeup. She squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that we'd talk after, asking me not to react yet. Then Montalvo stood up, tapped his wine glass with a fork, and commanded the room's attention with practiced ease. He launched into a speech about resilience, growth, and the bright future he envisioned for Novacore. Soon, he shifted to talking about the European division, painting London as both a problem and an opportunity waiting to be seized. Then, with a wide smile, he announced that Laura had graciously agreed to take on the role of managing director for European operations. Applause erupted, chairs scraped, and people turned to offer Laura congratulations, completely unaware she hadn't actually given her consent. I sat frozen, clapping mechanically, trying to absorb the fact that he'd just made a massive decision for her in front of witnesses. Laura rose to her feet, slipping on her CEO mask, and thanked everyone with the kind of polished speech that hid the tremor in her hands. She said the right phrases about commitment, vision, and stepping up when the company needed it most. Nobody, it seemed, noticed how tight her smile was or how her eyes didn't match the enthusiasm in her voice. When she sat back down, I leaned in and whispered, "Did you really agree to that?" Her reply, barely audible over the chatter, made my chest ache. He cornered me. Said if I refused here and now, he'd question my fitness as CEO. We stayed only as long as politeness required, then excused ourselves early, leaving behind champagne flutes and polite lies. Outside, snow fell heavily again, echoing that first night, but with none of the magic, only a sense of impending loss. In the parking lot, under yellow streetlights and swirling snow, Laura finally broke, tears spilling faster than she could wipe them away. "I'm so sorry," she kept repeating, as if she'd chosen this, as if she'd deliberately walked away from us. She explained how Montalvo had framed everything, making it clear he'd interpret any refusal as a lack of commitment to the company. She talked about how long she'd dreamed of proving herself, of being the kind of leader who got called in to fix what others couldn't. But every syllable about London landed like another nail in the coffin of whatever we were building. We talked about long distance, video calls, visits whenever possible, the kinds of hopeful plans people make when they don't want to let go. Even as we said the words, we both knew how brutal 2 or 3 years across an ocean would be. She told me the official move date, February 1st, just 5 weeks away, already marked on countless calendars and planning documents. Montalvo had told her he expected absolute focus on the transition, no distractions, a word that hung between us with ugly clarity. Those weeks that followed became a countdown, each day carrying both tenderness and an unsaid goodbye. We clung to each moment together, even as the clock ticked louder in the background, insisting that something had to give. The storm that hit Boston on January 18th was the kind that shuts down cities and makes you question why anyone lives in such a climate. Snow pounded against the windows of Novacor's office tower, and the wind howled like it wanted to peel the glass from the frames. I was still at my desk late, half working, half distracting myself from the thought of Laura's upcoming departure. Suddenly, an emergency alert flashed across my monitor and phone. Heating system failure in the building, immediate evacuation required. A recorded voice repeated the message over the intercom, instructing everyone to leave the premises as quickly as possible. I grabbed my coat, shoved my laptop into my bag, and joined the stream of people heading for the exits. Just as I was about to step into the lobby, another internal notification appeared on the screens by the elevators. CEO still in building, top floor, remaining in office. It read, as if that were a perfectly normal footnote instead of a crisis. My heart dropped, because I knew her habits too well. Friday nights were when she'd hole up in her office to plow through work. If the heat was off, it would only get colder by the minute up there, and she'd be the last person to notice her own limits. I went to security and told them someone needed to go get her, but they said emergency services were already on their way. Given the storm, that could mean an hour in a building losing heat, with winds howling outside like something alive. I pictured her hunched over her laptop, ignoring alarms, telling herself she could finish just one more thing before listening. Waiting for help suddenly felt like the wrong choice, like standing still in a burning building because someone told you the fire brigade was en route. I dashed to the maintenance room and grabbed anything that looked remotely useful: an old crowbar, a couple of emergency blankets, a dusty flashlight. When I reached the door to the stairwell, I found it sealed with a thin, glittering layer of ice along the edges. I jammed the crowbar into the gap and pulled with everything I had, muscles screaming, metal groaning in protest. The first attempt barely budged the door, the second made it creak but not open, and on the third I felt something in my shoulder snap or strain. I ignored the pain and kept working at it, prying and forcing until at last the door opened just enough for me to squeeze through. On the other side, the stairwell greeted me like a vertical tunnel of freezing air and echoing silence. The flashlight's beam was weak, but it was better than nothing as I started to climb. Each floor I passed was marked by a closed door and a small painted number, but they blurred together in the cold. My breath came out in rapid white puffs, and soon I could see it swirling in front of me even without the flashlight. Halfway up, the flashlight flickered and then died completely, leaving me with only my phone's dwindling battery for light. My legs burned like I'd spent hours at the gym, and my shoulder throbbed from each time I'd used it to brace my weight against the door. Somewhere around the 12th floor, I heard cracking sounds in the walls, ice expanding in pipes, maybe, or just the building complaining. Each ominous noise spurred me to move faster, irrationally imagining the structure itself freezing solid around us. By the 20th floor, the phone showed only a sliver of battery remaining, and every stair felt heavier than the last. I used the railing to pull myself up the final flights, my hands numb and barely registering the cold metal. When I shoved open the door to the 23rd floor, the hallway beyond felt like another world, quiet and eerily still. Laura's office door was closed but not locked, and it swung inward when I pushed it. Inside, she sat at her desk, still working, wearing her suit jacket as if it were a winter coat, fingers trembling over the keyboard. Her lips carried a faint blue tinge, and her skin looked almost translucent in the office lighting. She blinked slowly when she saw me, like she couldn't quite focus on my face or understand why I was there. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her words sluggish, as if moving through molasses. "Everyone else left. It's fine." I crossed the room in a few steps and took her hands in mine. They were so cold they didn't feel like human skin. "The heating failed," I told her firmly. "The building's been evacuated for nearly an hour. We have to go now." She tried to brush it off, insisted she just needed 10 more minutes to finish a report for the London team. Listening to her insist on a deadline while her body screamed danger was surreal and terrifying at the same time. I recognized the early signs of hypothermia, the confusion, the slurred words, the stubborn insistence on continuing as if nothing were wrong. I wrapped one emergency blanket around her shoulders, and she feebly tried to push it away, mumbling about needing both hands to type. Her coordination was shot, though, so the blanket stayed, a flimsy but vital barrier between her and the creeping cold. I draped the second blanket over her and asked her to stand, but when she tried, her legs simply gave out beneath her. I caught her before she hit the desk, shocked at how light she felt, more like lifting a bundle of clothes than a fully conscious person. The woman who had held boardrooms in the palm of her hand now couldn't stand without help, reduced to raw human fragility. I scooped her up, blankets and all, bracing her against my chest as I turned toward the door. The descent down those 23 flights was the hardest physical thing I've ever done in my life. She kept mumbling about needing to go back for her laptop, about presentations, about expectations in London. Her thoughts looped and frayed, never quite landing anywhere coherent, a sign of how far gone she really was. When her shivering started to slow instead of increase, real fear lodged itself in my throat, because that was the sign her body was giving up. By the time I got her to my truck, my muscles felt like they were made of burning lead, and my hands barely obeyed commands. I buckled her in, cranked the heat to full blast, and drove through near-whiteout conditions toward the hospital. Traffic lights glowed hazy and distant through the snow, and more than once I ran a red rather than stop and lose momentum. Emergency vehicles were some of the only other cars on the road, their sirens muffled by the storm. Laura drifted in and out of awareness, saying less and less as the miles crawled by. When we reached Boston General, I yelled for help, and a team of nurses and doctors rushed her away from me. I was left in the waiting room with my battered shoulder, numb fingers, and a fear that sat like ice in my chest. They wrapped my hands and gave me something for the pain, but none of that mattered compared to what might be happening behind closed doors. Time stretched, marked only by people being called back, coffee being poured, and the beeping of machines echoing down the hall. When a doctor finally approached and said the words, "She's stable," I exhaled fully for the first time in hours. The doctor explained that Laura had moderate hypothermia, but that they'd managed to bring her core temperature back up in time. She mentioned, almost in passing, that someone had carried her down the stairs from the top floor of a freezing building. I barely registered the implied praise. All I cared about was that Laura was alive and conscious. "She's asking for you," the doctor added, and that simple sentence felt like a rope thrown to someone drowning. I followed her down a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion, each step echoing with possibility. Laura was sitting up in a hospital bed, wrapped in heated blankets, with an foreline in her arm and color returning to her cheeks. When our eyes met, hers filled instantly with tears, and whatever composure she'd tried to muster dissolved. "They told me what you did," she said, voice shaking. "The frozen door, the stairs. Daniel, you could have gotten hurt, too." I sank into the chair by her bed, feeling every bit as worn out as I probably looked. "Of course I did it," I replied. "I love you. That doesn't stop just because London is on your calendar." She broke down completely then, sobs racking her body even as the blankets tried to keep it warm. She admitted she'd been trying to convince herself that taking the London role was the only responsible choice. She told me she'd been unable to sleep or eat properly since New Year's, dragging herself into work at dawn to avoid going home. "I kept telling myself it was just transition stress," she said, "but it's not. It's the thought of leaving you behind." I took her hand and held it like it was the anchor tethering both of us to something solid. "Then don't go," I said simply. "Stay? Just once. Choose what you want instead of what everyone expects from you." She shook her head, saying it wasn't that simple, that the world would see her refusing London as a sign of weakness or misplaced priorities. "How do I tell them I passed up a major assignment because I fell in love with a junior analyst?" she asked, half bitter, half heartbroken. That was when anger, not at her, but at the entire system, started to simmer in my chest. I was tired of watching her measure her worth solely in sacrifices made on the altar of her career. Sitting there, shoulder throbbing, brain exhausted, an idea began to form, wild and audacious but strangely clear. I thought about every spreadsheet I'd analyzed, every inefficiency I'd noticed, every conversation we'd had about the need for change. Novacor didn't just have a European problem. It had a modernization problem, a tech infrastructure problem, a future problem. So I suggested we stop treating London as the only possible big move the company could make. What if there was another path? I said, something bold that happens here, not across an ocean. I proposed creating a new executive role, Chief Innovation Officer, dedicated to leading a full-scale digital transformation. The position would report directly to the board and to her, giving it visibility and authority. I told her I wanted to compete for that role, not as a favor or a shortcut, but as someone who knew the company from the inside out. We could present a detailed plan to the board, strategy, costs, timelines, risk mitigation, and let them decide if I deserve the position. If they approve it, I said, then it's not nepotism. It's a board-sanctioned move. And if they don't, at least we tried to build another option. She stared at me like she was seeing a version of me she hadn't yet met, not the hesitant man in the parking lot before a blind date. "This is insane," she said, though there was something like hope glinting behind her eyes. "They're brutal in that room." She pointed out that Montalvo would pick apart any weak point, that the board wouldn't hesitate to expose inexperience or flaws. I told her I knew that, and that I planned to prepare as if my entire life depended on it, because in a way, it did. She reminded me that no junior analyst had ever walked into a board meeting to pitch their own executive role before. I answered that someone had to be first, and that Novacor's hesitation to innovate was partly why London was in trouble to begin with. She laughed through tears, shaking her head, calling me reckless in the most affectionate way I'd ever heard it said. Then she squeezed my hand and said the words that made everything real. "Okay, let's go all in on this crazy plan." That night, while machines beeped softly around us and snowstorm winds rattled the hospital windows, we started plotting what came next. For the first time since London had entered the picture, the path ahead didn't look like a one-way road to goodbye. The following days turned into a quiet war waged with spreadsheets, slide decks, and very little sleep. I did my regular job by day and spent my evenings and nights crafting the presentation that could change both our lives. Andres, once the voice of caution, joined me, helping build financial models and stress testing assumptions from every angle. Sophia slipped me internal reports and data sets I'd never have seen as a junior analyst, giving the plan real depth and credibility. Even Carla from Sterling Grill checked in with a text. You've survived worse storms. Go get them, Compass Boy. Laura, for her part, scheduled a board meeting for February 1st, the very day she was supposed to leave for London. She informed Montalvo she wanted to present a major strategic initiative before committing fully to any relocation. He agreed reluctantly, knowing that outright refusal would make him look resistant to innovation in front of the rest of the board. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, compass keychain in hand, repeating its message, find your way forward. Then I put on a suit that suddenly felt like armor and drove to the office, heart pounding but mind clear. The boardroom was as intimidating as I'd imagined. A long polished table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and 8 people who could end or reshape my career. Laura introduced me with her professional voice, making no hint of our personal connection, just my role and the fact that I had a strategic proposal. I took my place at the head of the room, plugged in my presentation, and forced my hands to stay steady as I clicked to the first slide. I talked about Novacore's outdated systems, about the hidden costs of clinging to old infrastructure while competitors moved ahead. I showed how delays, errors, and inefficiencies were quietly draining money and burning out employees across multiple departments. Then I outlined the transformation: cloud migration, automation of repetitive tasks, unified platforms, and a culture shift toward innovation. Every point came with projected savings, risk assessments, and case studies from similar companies that had successfully modernized. I framed it not as a tech upgrade, but as a survival strategy, a way to ensure Novacore was still relevant 5 or 10 years down the line. Montalvo pounced with sharp questions about costs, timelines, and potential fallout if implementation went wrong. I responded calmly, leaning on the data we'd gathered, the scenarios we'd modeled, and the reality of what doing nothing would cost instead. Other board members weighed in, some skeptical, some intrigued, all aware that this was a big ask from someone at my level. They wanted to know why I believed I could lead a project of this magnitude without prior executive experience. I told them the truth, that my years buried in the numbers had given me a ground-level view of where the company was bleeding. I emphasized that the role would include building a team of seasoned experts and that I didn't see myself as a lone hero, but as a catalyst. I pointed out that one advantage of my current position was understanding both the constraints of the lower rungs and the goals of the top. We went back and forth for what felt like hours, but the clock on the wall said 45 minutes when I clicked to the final slide. I finished by saying that Novacore was already standing at a crossroads. One path led to slow decline, the other to difficult but necessary change. Then I stepped back, thanked them for their time, and left the room when Montalvo asked for a closed discussion. Out in the hall, my pulse hammered against my ribs while I paced, the compass in my pocket grounding me with its familiar weight. Laura remained inside, unable to advocate directly, limited to answering questions and letting the pitch speak for itself. When they called me back in, the atmosphere felt heavier, decisive. Montalvo glanced around the table, then announced that they had put the proposal and my appointment to a vote. In turn, each board member raised a hand, and I counted silently. 1, 2, 3, 7 hands up in favor. Montalvo abstained, his neutrality a statement in itself, but not enough to sink the decision. The motion passes, he said, pending standard HR and contractual procedures. Daniel Herrera will assume the role of Chief Innovation Officer. I didn't let my shoulders drop until I was out of the room, the door closing behind me like the end of one life and the start of another. Laura and I kept our distance until we were far from public view, walking in silence down to the parking garage. Once we were shielded by concrete and out of sight, she grabbed my tie, pulled me close, and kissed me like we'd just stormed a fortress together. You did it, she whispered against my lips. You walked into that room and proved every single one of them wrong. We did it, I corrected. You gave me the shot. You believed I was capable of more than the box I was stuck in. She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, her expression glowing with a mix of pride and relief. Then she told me something I hadn't known until that moment, that she'd already called Montalvo earlier that morning. She had officially declined the London position, telling him she intended to lead Novacore's future from its home base instead. He'd been furious, accusing her of passing up a prestigious opportunity. But with the board backing our new initiative, he couldn't oust her. I asked if she was worried about the rumors, about people saying she chose a relationship over her career. In response, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a keychain identical to mine. Another silver compass, same engraving. "Let them talk," she said, brushing her thumb over the words, "Find your way forward." "I'm choosing both, my career and the life I actually want." She held her compass against mine, the two pieces catching the harsh garage light and reflecting it back at us. We read the engraving together, like a promise we were making not just to each other, but to ourselves. In that moment, surrounded by cold concrete and the echo of distant engines, it felt like we'd finally stepped onto our own path. A year later, on December 20th, I pulled my truck into the parking lot of Sterling Grill again. This time, I wasn't rehearsing excuses or counting reasons to run. I was checking my pocket every few seconds to make sure the ring box was still there. The restaurant looked almost exactly as it had that first night. Same garlands, same over-the-top tree, same soft holiday music. Inside, Laura was at the bar talking to Carla, who'd become a friend and unofficial commentator on our disaster to fairy tale story. When I walked in, Laura's face lit up the way it always did now, like seeing me was the best part of her day. We picked the same corner booth we'd occupied on that chaotic first date, the one where she shivered in my coat, and I tried not to fall apart. I asked if she knew what day it was, and she smiled, saying, "Of course, anniversary of the worst and best first date in history." "We were such a mess," she laughed. "You thought Carla was me, and I practically swam through a blizzard to get here." "We were a mess," I agreed. "And somehow, we were also exactly right." Then I took the compass keychain from my keys, placed it on the table between us, and told her it had guided me straight to her. I dropped to one knee there in that same booth, pulled out the velvet box, and felt time stretch the way it had so many times before with her. "Laura Campos," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "You told me to find my way forward, and it led here. Will you marry me?" She started laughing and crying all at once, and then reached into her own bag with shaking hands. Out came another small box, and she admitted she'd planned to propose that night too. "Why should you get all the romantic credit?" she teased, tears still in her eyes. "I walked through a blizzard, remember?" We ended up sliding rings onto each other's fingers at the same time, both proposals accepted, both of us half laughing from the sheer absurdity. Carla appeared with champagne we hadn't ordered, raising a glass to my favorite disaster couple of all time. We toasted to blizzards and broken elevators, to frozen stairwells and hospital rooms, to compasses and courage. We toasted to second chances, to choosing our own path instead of the one everyone else said we should follow. We walked out into the falling snow not as two people afraid of doors and dates, but as partners who'd learned that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the important thing anyway. If you've stayed with me to the end of this story, maybe you're standing in front of your own kind of door right now. Maybe you've been feeling stuck, convinced that your chance passed years ago, or that you don't deserve something better. Maybe you've let fear, old wounds, or other people's expectations keep you parked outside the places you secretly long to enter. I can't promise you a Hollywood ending, but I can tell you this. Moving forward almost always starts with one small, terrifying decision. Stepping out of the truck, answering the call, admitting what you want, asking for help, saying no to what looks impressive but feels wrong. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear which moment hit closest to home. Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories about love, courage, and starting again. And the next time life hands you a storm and a difficult choice, remember the words on that little silver compass. You don't need a perfect map or a guarantee, just the willingness to take one step. Find your way forward.